For 7 years, Caroline wrote down conversations her husband insisted had never happened. Every argument, every denial, every moment he looked her in the eyes and calmly told her that what she remembered wasn't real. 41 notebooks, thousands of pages. And one day, those notebooks would become the evidence that brought an entire courtroom to silence. But when Caroline first met Richard, she wasn't documenting abuse. She wasn't preparing for a legal battle. She wasn't trying to prove she was sane. She thought she had found the love of her life. The kind of love people spend years praying for. The kind of love that feels so rare, so extraordinary, that when it finally arrives, you can't imagine letting it go. Which raises a terrifying question. How does someone go from planning a future with the person they love to secretly documenting every conversation because they're afraid they're losing their mind? And perhaps an even more unsettling question. What if the person destroying your reality is the same person everyone else believes is perfect? This is Caroline's story. And by the end of it, you'll understand why some of the deepest wounds never leave a bruises. There are monsters that announce themselves. And then there are monsters who bring flowers. Monsters who volunteer at charity events. Monsters who remember birthdays. Monsters who smile for family photographs and wave at neighbors from perfectly trimmed front lawns. Richard belonged to the second category, the dangerous category, because the most dangerous people rarely look dangerous. If you had met Richard in those early years, you probably would have liked him. Most people did. He wasn't loud, he wasn't arrogant, he didn't dominate conversations. In fact, he had mastered something much more powerful. He made other people feel important. He remembered details, the name of your dog, the promotion you got 6 months ago, the story you casually mentioned over dinner and forgot about afterward. He remembered everything. People walked away from conversations with Richard feeling seen, and that made them trust him. Caroline trusted him too. The first time they met was at a friend's barbecue on a humid Tennessee afternoon. Nothing about the day felt extraordinary. Children ran through sprinklers. Music played softly from a portable speaker. Adults stood around folding tables talking about work, mortgages, football, and everything else adults talk about when they're trying to convince themselves life isn't moving too quickly. Then Richard walked into the backyard. And within minutes, Caroline noticed him, not because he was the loudest person there, because he seemed completely comfortable in his own skin. The kind of confidence that doesn't need attention because it already assumes it belongs. They talked for nearly 2 hours that afternoon. At one point, the party around them seemed to disappear entirely. By sunset, they had exchanged phone numbers. By midnight, Richard had already sent her a message. By the end of the week, she was smiling every time his name appeared on her phone. Friends later described their relationship as effortless. The truth is that it felt even better than that. It felt destined. Richard remembered everything she told him. Her favorite restaurant, her childhood dreams, the books she loved, the insecurities she rarely shared. And every time he remembered one of those details later, Caroline felt understood, seen, chosen. What she didn't know was that some people don't collect details because they care. Some people collect details because information is power. And Richard was paying attention far more carefully than anyone realized. Because while Caroline was falling in love, Richard was studying her, learning her fears, learning her hopes, learning exactly what she needed to hear. And once he knew those things, he would use them. But that part of the story was still years away. For now, Caroline believed she had found the safest place in the world. The tragedy is that she wasn't walking into safety, she was walking into a trap. And by the time she realized it, Richard had already become part of every corner of her life. But before we continue, I'd love to hear from you. Where are you watching from today? Let me know in the comments below. I always enjoy seeing where these stories are reaching people around the world. And if you're enjoying this story so far, take a moment to subscribe to Whispered Chapter Tales and turn on notifications so you never miss a future chapter. What Caroline didn't realize was that the man she believed was her safest place in the world was slowly becoming the reason she would one day question her own reality. The wedding took place on a cool October afternoon, beneath a canopy of Tennessee trees painted gold and copper by autumn. It looked like something from a movie. Friends and family filled the white folding chairs arranged neatly across the lawn. Children chased each other through fallen leaves. Laughter drifted through the air. Caroline's father cried during the ceremony. Her mother cried before it even started, and when Caroline walked down the aisle, Richard looked at her with tears in his eyes. Years later, people would still talk about that wedding. Not because anything extraordinary happened, because it seemed perfect. The kind of day people point to when they say, those two were made for each other. And for a while, it genuinely felt that way. The first years of marriage were happy. Not pretend to be happy. Not the kind of happiness people perform for social media. Real happiness. The kind built from ordinary moments. Weekend grocery trips, movie nights on the couch, road trips with no destination, falling asleep beside someone who feels like home. Within a few years, they bought a house together. A beautiful two-story home in a quiet neighborhood where children rode bicycles until sunset and neighbors knew one another by name. Then came Marcus. 2 years later, Lily. And suddenly life became soccer practices, school projects, pediatrician appointments, birthday parties, and sleepless nights. It was busy, messy, exhausting, wonderful. From the outside, their lives looked almost ideal. If you had asked anyone who knew them during those years, they would have described them as one of the strongest couples they knew. Richard coached Little League. Caroline organized school fundraisers. They hosted Christmas parties, attended church regularly, volunteered in the community. They looked exactly like the family everyone secretly wished they could become, and that was the problem, because the most dangerous traps are the ones that look like dreams. The first crack appeared so quietly that Caroline barely noticed it. Years later, she would struggle to remember the exact moment it happened, not because it wasn't important, because it seemed so small. One evening, she was getting ready for dinner with friends. She stood in front of the bedroom mirror, adjusting a dress she hadn't worn in months. When Richard walked into the room, he stopped and looked at her. Not angrily, not critically, just thoughtfully. Then he smiled. A small smile. The kind that made her lower her guard. "You're really going to wear that?" The comment wasn't harsh. If anything, it sounded playful. Caroline laughed. "What's wrong with it?" Richard shrugged. "Nothing." A pause. "I just thought you might want something a little more flattering." Then he walked away. That was all. No argument, no shouting, no fight. Nothing dramatic. Yet for the rest of the evening, Caroline couldn't stop thinking about it. When she looked in the mirror before leaving, she changed outfits. Years later, she wouldn't remember what either dress looked like. What she remembered was how strange it felt that a single sentence had changed her entire mood. At the time, she dismissed it. Everyone says insensitive things occasionally. Everyone has bad days. Nobody is perfect. That explanation made sense, until it happened again, and again, and again. Not every day, not every week, just often enough to plant doubt. A comment about her clothes, a comment about her friends, a comment about how she handled a conversation, a comment about how she laughed too loudly at a restaurant, a comment about how emotional she became during disagreements. Individually, each remark seemed harmless. Together, they formed something else, something harder to identify. Like individual drops of water slowly carving a canyon. The changes happened gradually, so gradually that Caroline never saw them happening. One day she realized she no longer wore certain outfits. One day she realized she hadn't called one of her closest friends in months. One day she realized she apologized constantly, for things that weren't her fault, for things that didn't require apologies, for existing too loudly, for feeling too much, for taking up space. And every time she adjusted herself to make life easier, Richard seemed pleased. Not excited, not grateful, simply satisfied, as though the adjustment had restored something to its proper place. Still, Caroline didn't think she was being controlled. If someone had suggested it, she would have laughed, because Richard never demanded. He suggested, he questioned, he sighed, he expressed concern. And there is a crucial difference between someone ordering you to change and someone making you feel responsible for changing yourself. One creates resistance, the other creates compliance. Without realizing it, Caroline had begun reorganizing her life around Richard's approval. And she wasn't the only one. Friends began noticing subtle changes. Amanda, Caroline's younger sister, noticed first. During family gatherings, Caroline seemed quieter, less spontaneous, more careful, almost as if she was constantly monitoring herself before speaking. Amanda mentioned it once during a phone call. Caroline laughed it off. "I'm just tired." Maybe she believed that. Maybe she needed to. Because the alternative was much harder to face. The alternative was that she was slowly becoming someone she didn't recognize. And the worst part? Richard wasn't becoming more controlling. He was becoming more believable. Every concern he expressed sounded reasonable. Every criticism sounded helpful. Every correction sounded loving, at least on the surface. Which is why nobody saw what was happening. Not Caroline, not her friends, not her family, not even Richard himself, perhaps. Because some forms of abuse don't arrive wearing a villain's face. They arrive disguised as concern, and by the time the disguise slips, the damage has already begun. But none of that compared to what happened next, because the next stage wasn't criticism, it wasn't control, it wasn't isolation, it was something far more dangerous, something that would eventually make Caroline question her own memory, her own judgment, her own reality, and the first time it happened, she didn't even realize it was happening. She simply walked away from a conversation feeling confused. The second time, she felt guilty. The third time, she apologized. By the 10th time, she was wondering if she was losing her mind. And that was exactly where Richard wanted her. The day Caroline first questioned her own reality began like any other ordinary Tuesday. But years later, she would remember every detail, because it was the day the gaslighting truly began. The strange thing about losing your grip on reality is that it doesn't feel dramatic when it begins. There is no thunderclap, no terrifying realization, no single moment when the world suddenly tilts beneath your feet. It begins quietly, so quietly that you mistake it for stress, for exhaustion, for a bad memory, for one of those harmless mistakes everyone makes from time to time. That Tuesday morning started like hundreds of others before it. Caroline woke before sunrise, made coffee, packed lunches for Marcus and Lily, helped find a missing shoe, signed a permission slip she had forgotten about until the last minute. By 8:15, the children were at school. By 9, she was sitting at the kitchen table answering work emails. Ordinary, forgettable, the kind of day nobody remembers, until something happens that changes the meaning of everything around it. That evening, Richard came home later than usual, not unusually late, just late enough for Caroline to notice. When he walked through the front door, she smiled and asked how his day had gone. He gave a short answer, dropped his keys onto the counter, then headed upstairs. Something felt off. Not wrong, just distant. At dinner, the distance remained. His answers were shorter. His attention drifted. Several times she caught him staring into space. Finally, after the children had gone to bed, she asked, "Is everything okay?" Richard looked up from his phone. "What do you mean? You seem upset." "I'm not upset." His tone wasn't hostile, just flat. Caroline hesitated. "Okay, maybe upset isn't the right word. Then why say it?" The question caught her off guard. "What? You said I was upset. You seemed upset." "No, you said I was upset." For a moment she simply stared at him. The conversation felt oddly slippery, as though something simple had suddenly become difficult to hold on to. "I wasn't trying to argue. I'm not arguing." Another pause. Then Richard sighed, a disappointed sigh, the kind that instantly made Caroline feel like she'd done something wrong. "You always assume something's wrong." The statement landed harder than it should have, because she wasn't sure it was true, but she also wasn't sure it wasn't. "Richard, I was just asking." And I answered. Caroline nodded slowly. The conversation ended there, at least outwardly, but as she lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, she found herself replaying it. Had she been accusing him? Had she overreacted? Maybe she had. Maybe she was becoming too sensitive. The thought bothered her. Not because she believed it, because she wasn't sure. 3 weeks later, it happened again. This time, the disagreement involved a school event. Caroline clearly remembered Richard agreeing to attend Marcus's baseball game. She remembered the conversation, where they were standing, what he was wearing, even the joke he had made afterward. So when he didn't show up, she was confused. When she asked about it later, she expected an apology. Instead, Richard frowned. "I never said I was going." The certainty in his voice was immediate, absolute. Caroline blinked. "Yes, you did." "No, I didn't." "You absolutely did." Richard shook his head. "Caroline, you're mistaken." The confidence with which he said it unsettled her, not because he sounded defensive, because he sounded sincere, as though he genuinely believed what he was saying. For the next 10 minutes they went back and forth. The more certain she became, the calmer he became. The calmer he became, the more uncertain she felt, until eventually she stopped arguing, not because she agreed, because she was exhausted. And later that night, a thought entered her mind for the first time. What if I remembered it wrong? It was a small thought, tiny, barely noticeable, but once it appeared, it refused to leave. Months passed, then years, and those moments multiplied. Conversations vanished, promises were denied, statements were rewritten, arguments were reversed. Events she remembered clearly became events Richard insisted had happened differently. Every disagreement followed the same pattern. At first, Caroline defended her memory, then Richard challenged it, then he questioned her interpretation, then her judgment, then her emotions. And somehow, by the end of the discussion, they were no longer talking about what had happened. They were talking about why Caroline was reacting so strongly, why she was always emotional, why she misunderstood things, why she remembered things incorrectly, why she seemed determined to create problems where none existed. It was masterful, not because it was clever, because it was repetitive. Reality wasn't destroyed in a single blow, it was eroded, one conversation at a time, one correction at a time, one doubt at a time, like waves slowly wearing down stone. And eventually the stone begins to believe the ocean. By the second year of their marriage, Caroline noticed something disturbing. She was apologizing constantly, not for mistakes, for memories, for feelings, for questions, for things she wasn't even certain she'd done wrong. She would walk into conversations confident and leave them apologizing. She would raise a concern and somehow become the problem. She would feel hurt and end up comforting the person who hurt her. The pattern became so familiar she stopped noticing it, until one evening changed everything. It happened on a Thursday. The children were asleep. Richard was watching television. Caroline was cleaning the kitchen. As she loaded dishes into the dishwasher, she remembered something he'd said 3 days earlier, something hurtful, something she hadn't addressed. She decided to bring it up, gently, carefully, the way she always did. Within 20 minutes, the conversation had spiraled. Richard denied saying it, then denied implying it, then denied the entire context of the discussion, then questioned why she was bringing it up at all, then suggested she might be projecting stress from work, then asked whether she'd considered talking to someone about her anxiety. When the conversation ended, Caroline stood alone in the kitchen, completely silent. The dishwasher hummed softly behind her. The television echoed faintly from the living room, and for the first time in her life she experienced something that terrified her. She couldn't remember if she was right, not because her memory had changed, because her confidence in it had. She stood there wondering whether the conversation she'd just experienced had happened the way she thought it had, wondering whether she was becoming unreliable, wondering whether something was wrong with her mind. That night, after Richard fell asleep, Caroline walked downstairs, opened a kitchen drawer, found an old composition notebook, and wrote down everything she could remember: the date, the time, the conversation, every detail. She wasn't gathering evidence. She wasn't planning an escape. She wasn't preparing for court. She simply needed somewhere outside her own head to place the truth. Because for the first time in her life, she was afraid she might lose it. She closed the notebook, placed it in the drawer, and went to bed. She had no way of knowing that one notebook would become 2, then 5, then 12, then 41, or that those notebooks would one day expose a truth Richard had spent years trying to bury. But something had changed. For the first time, part of Caroline no longer trusted Richard's version of reality. And once that doubt appears, control becomes much harder to maintain. What Caroline didn't realize was that Richard had already noticed the shift. And people who rely on control rarely surrender it willingly. The next phase would be worse, much worse, because when doubt stopped working, Isolation began. The first person Caroline lost was her friend Jessica. Not through a fight, not through betrayal, not through some dramatic falling out that left both sides angry. Jessica simply disappeared. Or at least that was how it felt at the time. The two women had been close for nearly a decade. Close enough to finish each other's sentences. Close enough to know when something was wrong without needing to ask. Close enough that Jessica had stood beside Caroline on her wedding day, holding a bouquet and wiping away tears. They had survived breakups together, career setbacks together, family emergencies together, the kind of friendship that most people spend a lifetime hoping to find. Then somehow, without either woman making a conscious decision, the friendship began to fade. At first, it was small. Jessica would invite Caroline to lunch. Caroline would decline. Not because she didn't want to go, because it suddenly felt complicated. Before every outing came questions. Not demands, questions. Richard was careful about that. "You're going out again? Didn't you just see her last week? Don't you think the kids need you home? I'm just surprised Jessica asks so much of your time." The words themselves seemed harmless, reasonable even, but they always left Caroline carrying something she hadn't been carrying before. Guilt. And guilt is remarkably effective, because unlike control, guilt feels self-generated. It feels like your own decision, your own conscience, your own responsibility. Eventually, saying no became easier than explaining yes. Months passed. Lunches became phone calls. Phone calls became text messages. Text messages became occasional holiday greetings. Then silence. Jessica wasn't angry. She was confused. She didn't understand why her friend kept drifting away. Neither did Caroline. At least not yet. The second person she lost was her brother. Not physically, emotionally. The distance happened so gradually that neither of them noticed it until years later. Her brother Michael had always been protective, the kind of older brother who checked your oil before road trips and showed up with a toolbox whenever something broke. He loved Richard initially. Everyone did. But over time, Michael started asking questions. Small ones, careful ones, questions that made Caroline uncomfortable. "Everything okay? Yeah? You sure?" "Of course." Michael would nod, but he never looked entirely convinced. Richard noticed that, and from that point forward, conversations about Michael changed. Richard never attacked him directly. That would have been obvious. Instead, he planted suggestions. "Your brother's always been a little controlling. Michael doesn't really respect boundaries. I think he likes creating drama. I'm just worried he influences how you see things." Nothing dramatic, nothing explosive, just enough to make Caroline hesitate before picking up the phone. Just enough to make her second-guess conversations that once felt natural. And slowly, another relationship weakened. Then came the career sacrifices. Unlike friendships, those changes looked practical, responsible, which made them much harder to recognize. When Caroline first met Richard, she was ambitious. She enjoyed her work, not because she was obsessed with success, because she liked solving problems. She liked feeling capable. She liked building something that belonged to her. Then Marcus was born. Then Lily. Life became busier, more demanding. And each time an opportunity appeared, Richard had a reason it wasn't the right time. The promotion would require longer hours. The client account would increase stress. The leadership role would mean more travel. And every argument sounded logical, reasonable, loving, at least on the surface. Family comes first. Money isn't everything. The kids need stability. What Caroline didn't notice was that every compromise moved in the same direction. Richard's career expanded. Hers contracted. Richard's independence increased. Hers diminished. Richard gained options. She lost them. Not all at once. One decision at a time. Like removing individual threads from a rope until the rope finally snaps. By year 5, Caroline had stopped applying for promotions entirely. Not because anyone forbade her, because she no longer believed they fit her life. And the frightening thing about that realization is this. The belief felt like her own. That's what makes coercive control so difficult to recognize. The victim often participates in their own confinement, not because they're weak, because they've been conditioned to believe the cage is their idea. By year 6, Caroline's world had become noticeably smaller. Not overnight, not dramatically, just measurably. Fewer friends, fewer opportunities, fewer people she could call without explanation, fewer places where Richard's influence didn't reach. And with every relationship that faded, Richard became more central, more important, more necessary. He wasn't just her husband anymore, he was becoming her entire support system, which meant that when he questioned her reality, there were fewer voices available to challenge him. When he criticized her judgment, there were fewer people reminding her she was capable. When he made her feel small, there were fewer places she could go to remember her size. That was the real purpose of the isolation. Not loneliness, dependency. Because a person surrounded by support is difficult to control. A person standing alone is much easier. Then something happened that Richard hadn't planned for. Something small. Something seemingly insignificant. A conversation at a grocery store. On a rainy Thursday afternoon, Caroline ran into Jessica, the friend she hadn't spoken to properly in nearly 2 years. The encounter lasted less than 10 minutes. But those 10 minutes changed everything. Jessica hugged her, stepped back, looked at her carefully, and asked a question no one else had dared ask. "Caroline, are you happy?" The question hit her harder than she expected. Not because she knew the answer. Because she didn't. For several seconds she simply stared, trying to respond, trying to smile, trying to produce the answer she was supposed to give. And for the first time, she couldn't. Jessica noticed. Friends notice things. Real friends notice things. The silence lasted only a few seconds, but it felt much longer. Then Jessica quietly said something Caroline would remember for years. "You don't seem like yourself anymore." Nothing dramatic, no accusations, no speeches, just an observation, a simple truth spoken aloud. And suddenly Caroline felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Seen, not judged, not analyzed. Seen. The feeling terrified her. Because once someone sees what's happening, you have to start confronting the possibility that it's real. She drove home that evening with Jessica's words echoing in her mind. You don't seem like yourself anymore. Who was herself? When had she changed? How long has it been happening? And perhaps most frightening of all, what if Jessica was right? That night, after Richard went to bed, Caroline pulled out one of the journals. Then another. Then another. For hours she sat at the kitchen table reading entries she had written over the years. Patterns began emerging. Not isolated incidents. Patterns. The same arguments. The same denials. The same emotional outcomes. Again. And again. And again. By 3 in the morning, the coffee beside her had gone cold. The house was silent. And Caroline was staring at a realization she could no longer ignore. The problem wasn't her memory. The problem wasn't her emotions. The problem wasn't her sensitivity. The problem wasn't her. For years she had been standing inside a maze trying to find the exit, and for the first time she was seeing the maze from above, seeing the design, seeing the pattern, seeing the person who built it. What she didn't know was that this moment, this quiet night at a kitchen table surrounded by journals, was the beginning of the end. Because once a victim begins seeing the pattern starts losing its power. And Richard was about to discover something he had never expected. Caroline was waking up. And people who depend on control rarely react well when control begins slipping away. The awareness would bring the most dangerous period of Caroline's life. Because awareness was only the first step. The second step was deciding what to do about it. And Richard was already sensing that something had changed. By the time Caroline finally called a therapist, she wasn't looking for answers. She was looking for relief. Relief from the exhaustion. Relief from the anxiety. Relief from the strange, persistent feeling that she was carrying something heavy she could no longer name. For months, her body had been sending signals she couldn't ignore. She wasn't sleeping. Or rather, she was sleeping the way frightened people sleep. One ear open, one eye half awake, never fully resting. She would wake at 3 in the morning with her heart racing for no reason she could identify. Sometimes she'd lie awake until sunrise. Other times, she'd drift back to sleep only to wake exhausted. Her appetite changed. 22 pounds disappeared over 8 months. Friends commented on the weight loss. Co-workers asked if she'd started a new diet. She laughed it off, said she was just busy. But deep down, she knew something wasn't right. Her body knew it before her mind was willing to admit it. And eventually, her doctor noticed too. It happened during a routine appointment. Nothing dramatic, a blood pressure check, a few routine questions. Then her physician looked up from the chart. "You seem tired." Caroline smiled politely. "I'm okay." The doctor paused, then asked a question that caught her off guard. "No. How are you really doing?" For reasons she couldn't explain, tears immediately filled her eyes. She hadn't planned to cry, hadn't even realized she needed to. Yet there she was, staring at the floor, while years of carefully maintained composure began to crack. A week later, she scheduled her first appointment with Dr. Renee Okafor, and that decision would change everything. The office wasn't what Caroline expected. It felt less clinical, more human. Warm lighting, bookshelves, comfortable chairs, a box of tissues positioned where years of experience suggested it would eventually be needed. Dr. Okafor greeted her with a calm smile. Nothing forced, nothing rehearsed, just present. The first session was uneventful. At least on the surface, Caroline talked about stress, work, parenting, the challenges of balancing family life, normal things, safe things, the kinds of things people discuss when they're not ready to tell the truth yet. Dr. Okafor listened, took notes, asked gentle questions. Nothing more. The second session went much the same way. The third session did not. Because during that session, Caroline mentioned the journals. Only briefly, almost accidentally. A passing comment, a small detail. Yet Dr. Okafor immediately noticed it. "You keep journals?" Caroline nodded. "Why did you start?" The answer came faster than she expected. "Because I needed to remember." The room fell quiet. For several seconds, neither woman spoke. Then Dr. Okafor asked softly, "Remember what?" And suddenly the words were pouring out. The arguments, the contradictions, the conversations that somehow always ended with her apologizing. The feeling that she was losing trust in her own memory. The constant uncertainty. The exhaustion. The confusion. The fear. For nearly an hour she talked. And when she finished, the room felt different. Lighter somehow. As though something that had been trapped inside her for years had finally found a way out. But the real turning point came 2 sessions later. A moment Caroline would remember for the rest of her life. It was raining outside. The steady rhythm of water tapped against the office windows. Caroline was describing another argument, another conversation that had somehow become her fault, another incident that left her questioning herself. When she finally finished, Dr. Okafor set down her pen, folded her hands, and leaned forward slightly. The movement was small, but Caroline sensed something important was coming. "Caroline," she said quietly, "I need you to hear me very clearly." Caroline nodded, her stomach tightened. Dr. Okafor held her gaze. "What you're describing isn't a communication problem." A pause, not a long one, just long enough. "What you're describing isn't a misunderstanding." Another pause. Then the words Caroline had spent years avoiding. The words that had visited her in dark moments before disappearing again. The words she was terrified might be true. "This is abuse." The room became completely silent. For a moment, Caroline couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't think. The words seemed to hang in the air between them. Heavy, unavoidable, real, abuse. Not conflict, not marital stress, not poor communication, not mutual dysfunction. Abuse. She stared at Dr. Okafor, waiting for the word to feel wrong, waiting for her to take it back, waiting for something inside her to reject it. Instead, something else happened, something much more frightening. Part of her felt relief, not because she wanted the word to be true, because she already knew it was. Somewhere deep down, beneath years of doubt and confusion and rationalization, she had known. She just hadn't been able to trust herself enough to say it. And now someone else had said it for her. Someone trained to recognize exactly these patterns. Someone who had spent decades helping people navigate situations like hers. The truth had finally been spoken aloud, and once spoken, it could never be unheard. After the appointment, Caroline sat alone in her car. Rain tapped against the windshield. Traffic moved through the parking lot around her. People came and went carrying groceries and coffee and umbrellas. Normal lives. Normal afternoons. Meanwhile, her entire understanding of her marriage was being rearranged. For 45 minutes she sat there, not crying, not panicking, just thinking, replaying years of memories through a completely different lens. Suddenly the patterns looked obvious. The isolation, the criticism, the control, the manipulation, the self-doubt, the constant need to explain herself, the shrinking of her world. It was all there, every piece, and for the first time the pieces fit together. The realization was both devastating and liberating, because once you understand what's happening to you, two things become impossible. You can no longer deny it, and you can no longer comfortably live with it. But here's the part many people don't understand. Realizing you're being abused does not automatically mean you leave. In fact, for many victims, awareness is the beginning of an even more complicated struggle, because now you know, and knowing creates decisions. Caroline had children, a home, shared finances, shared responsibilities, shared history. She wasn't deciding whether to leave a relationship, she was deciding whether to dismantle an entire life. And there was another reality she couldn't ignore. Richard wasn't going anywhere. If she left, he would still be the father of her children. He would still be connected to Marcus and Lily. He would still have access to them. That terrified her more than anything, because Caroline had begun noticing something she hadn't wanted to acknowledge. The subtle ways Richard manipulated the children, too. Not aggressively, not obviously, just enough to make her uneasy, enough to make her realize that if she left without a plan, she could lose control over what happened next. And so she made a decision that would ultimately change everything. She would not leave immediately, she would prepare, quietly, carefully, patiently, and most importantly, she would document everything. What Caroline didn't realize was that the next 22 months would become the most important months of her life. Because while Richard believed he still controlled the narrative, his wife was building a record. One journal entry at a time, one photograph at a time, one saved document at a time. And when the day finally came to walk away, she wasn't going to walk away empty-handed. She was going to walk away with the truth. And the truth, once documented, is a very difficult thing to bury. There is a moment that exists in almost every story of survival, a moment most people never see, because it happens long before the escape, long before the courtroom, long before the public victory. It happens in silence. It happens when someone who has spent years feeling powerless makes a private decision. A decision so small nobody else notices it, yet powerful enough to change everything that follows. For Caroline, that moment arrived on a cold February morning, 3 weeks after Dr. Okafor named what was happening, 3 weeks after the word abuse entered her life and refused to leave. She was standing in her kitchen making coffee when she realized something. For years, she had been waiting for Richard to change, waiting for him to understand, waiting for him to wake up one morning and suddenly become the man she thought she married, waiting for a conversation, waiting for an apology, waiting for a breakthrough, waiting for a miracle. And then a thought entered her mind. Simple, clear, devastating. What if he already knows? The question hit her harder than anything Dr. Okafor had said, because it forced her to consider a possibility she had spent years avoiding. What if Richard wasn't confused? What if he wasn't struggling to communicate? What if he wasn't accidentally hurting her? What if he knew exactly what he was doing? For several minutes she stood motionless in the kitchen, coffee forgotten, heart pounding, because if the answer was yes, then waiting was pointless, and if waiting was pointless, something else had to happen. That morning, Caroline stopped waiting and started preparing. The first step was information, not evidence. Information. She needed to understand the reality of her situation, not the version Richard described, the actual reality. So she began reviewing financial records, carefully, quietly, methodically, nothing dramatic, just statements, tax returns, retirement accounts, mortgage documents, insurance policies, the ordinary paperwork of adult life, documents most married couples never think about until they suddenly need them. At first, she expected nothing unusual. Then she noticed discrepancies, small ones, a transfer she didn't remember discussing, an account she didn't recognize, a credit card she rarely saw. Nothing illegal, nothing explosive, just information she should have known but didn't. The discovery unsettled her, not because of the money, because of what it represented: control, knowledge, access, power. The person who controls information often controls everything else. And Richard understood that. Over the following months, Caroline created a routine, a second life hidden inside her first one. During the day, she was still the same wife, the same mother, the same woman attending school functions and church events and neighborhood cookouts. Nothing changed externally, at least not yet, but privately, a transformation was taking place. The journals became more detailed. Dates, times, conversations, witnesses, financial decisions, patterns. Every entry became another piece of a larger picture. She photographed documents, stored copies in secure cloud accounts, backed up files, created records, preserved timelines, not because she enjoyed it, because she was beginning to understand something crucial. Memory can be challenged. Documentation cannot. The realization gave her a sense of stability she hadn't felt in years. Every journal entry became an anchor. Every saved document became proof that reality existed outside Richard's interpretation of it. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't merely surviving. She was building something, a foundation. Around this time, Dr. Okafor encouraged her to expand her support system. The suggestion terrified her, because isolation doesn't disappear the moment you recognize it. Even after identifying the cage, opening the door feels dangerous. Still, Caroline knew she couldn't do this alone, so she made a call she had avoided for years. Amanda answered on the second ring. Her younger sister's voice sounded exactly the same. Warm, familiar, safe. The conversation began casually, then slowly shifted, then finally broke open. And for nearly 2 hours, Caroline told the truth, the whole truth. Not the edited version, not the socially acceptable version, the real version. Amanda listened, mostly in silence, and when Caroline finally finished, expecting judgment or disbelief, her sister said something that made her cry harder than anything else that day. "I've been worried about you for years. Years. Not months. Years." Amanda hadn't known the details, hadn't understood the full extent, but she'd seen enough to know something wasn't right. That realization was both comforting and heartbreaking, because it meant Caroline hadn't imagined the changes. Other people had seen them too. Then came the attorney, David Harrington, family law specialist, 19 years of experience, a reputation for thoroughness, and absolutely no patience for theatrics. Their first meeting took place on a Thursday afternoon. Caroline arrived carrying 3 journals, just 3, the earliest ones. She wasn't sure why she brought them. Perhaps she needed someone else to see them, to confirm they mattered. David spent most of the meeting listening. No dramatic reactions, no promises, no speeches, just questions, precise questions, dates, timelines, incidents, documentation. By the end of the meeting, his yellow legal pad was covered in notes. He sat quietly for several moments, then asked, "How many journals do you have?" Caroline hesitated. 41. David blinked. The first visible reaction she'd seen from him all afternoon. 41? She nodded. For a moment he looked down at the legal pad, then back at her. And in that moment something shifted. The attorney stopped looking at her like a potential client, and started looking at her like someone carrying evidence. Real evidence. The kind most people never think to preserve. The kind that survives scrutiny. The kind that changes cases. "Can I review them?" he asked. Caroline nodded. 2 weeks later he called. His voice was calm, measured, professional. Yet underneath it she detected something else. Confidence. "We can do this." 4 simple words. But after years of being told she was confused, emotional, unstable, mistaken, those 4 words felt revolutionary. What Richard didn't know was that the ground beneath him had already begun shifting. He still believed he controlled the story, still believed he controlled the narrative, still believed Caroline doubted herself, and in some ways, she still did. Healing wasn't immediate. Fear hadn't disappeared. Neither had uncertainty. But something fundamental had changed. Caroline no longer needed Richard to tell her what was true. She had her journals, she had her therapist, she had her sister, she had her attorney, and slowly, piece by piece, she was rebuilding trust in her own reality, the very thing Richard had spent years dismantling. 22 months passed. 22 months of preparation, 22 months of documentation, 22 months of pretending everything was normal while quietly building a case that would eventually shake an entire courtroom. Then one Tuesday morning, everything changed. A process server walked up Richard's driveway, knocked on the front door, and handed him an envelope. Inside was the one thing he never believed Caroline would have the courage to do: a divorce petition. At first, there was silence, then confusion, then disbelief, and finally, fury. Not loud fury, not screaming fury. Something colder, far more dangerous. The kind of fury that appears when someone realizes they are losing control. For years, Richard had written the story. Now someone else was holding the pen, and he was about to discover exactly how much Caroline had been writing down. The war he thought he was prepared for was not the war that was coming. Because Caroline wasn't arriving with accusations, she was arriving with evidence. And evidence has a way of surviving even the most convincing lies. The courtroom battle that followed would become one of the most talked about cases the county had seen in years. But nobody, not Richard, not his attorney, not even Caroline herself, could have predicted what was about to happen when 41 journals finally entered the record. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning, a completely ordinary Tuesday, the kind of day that begins without warning, the kind of day that feels insignificant until something happens that divides your life into before and after. Richard was leaving for work when the process server pulled into the driveway. The interaction lasted less than a minute. A signature, a manila envelope, a brief explanation. Then the stranger turned and walked away. Richard stood alone on the front porch, staring at the documents in his hands. For several seconds, he didn't move, didn't react, didn't speak. Because there are moments so unexpected that the mind rejects them before it understands them. And this was one of those moments. Caroline had filed for divorce. Not threatened, not discussed, not suggested. Filed. Officially, legally, irreversibly. For years, Richard had believed many things about his wife: that she was emotional, that she doubted herself, that she needed him more than she realized, that she would never actually leave. The papers in his hands challenged every one of those assumptions. At first, he laughed, a short laugh, disbelieving, almost amused. Then he opened the petition, and the amusement disappeared. Because this wasn't an emotional decision. This wasn't a desperate reaction. This wasn't a bluff. The filing was organized, detailed, prepared. Someone had helped her. Someone had planned this. And suddenly Richard understood something he had never seriously considered before. Caroline had been moving in silence. That evening the atmosphere inside the house felt different. Not loud, not explosive. Something worse, controlled. The kind of control that exists right before a storm. Caroline was helping Lily with homework when Richard walked into the room. She looked up. Their eyes met. Neither spoke immediately. The children sensed it too. Children always do, even when they don't understand what they're sensing. Richard waited until the children were asleep. Then he found her in the kitchen. The divorce papers sat folded on the counter between them. For a long moment neither spoke. Then Richard asked a single question. Who helped you? Not, why are you doing this? Not, can we talk? Not, what's happened? Who helped you? Because somewhere beneath the anger, Richard already knew. This wasn't the Caroline he thought he understood. This Caroline had become dangerous. Not physically, not emotionally, legally, strategically, and most importantly, she no longer appeared afraid. Caroline looked at him calmly. I helped myself. The answer landed harder than she intended. Richard's jaw tightened. For years, he had expected explanations, defenses, apologies. Now he was receiving none, and that frightened him more than he would ever admit. Over the following days, Richard transformed. Not publicly. Publicly, he remained exactly the same. Professional, friendly, composed. The version of Richard everyone loved. Privately, however, Another version emerged, a colder version, a calculating version, a version Caroline had only glimpsed before. He hired one of the most aggressive family law attorneys in the county, Gregory Walsh, a man famous for turning divorces into wars. Walsh had built a career on attrition, pressure, exhaustion. He understood something most attorneys understood well. Many cases aren't won through evidence. They're won by wearing people down. And when Richard hired him, the message was clear. This was not going to be an easy separation. It was going to be a battle. The first attack came quickly. And it wasn't aimed at Caroline's case. It was aimed at her credibility. Friends began acting differently. Conversations became awkward. Invitations slowed. People who had once called regularly became distant. At first, Caroline didn't understand why. Then she started hearing things. Comments, rumors, concerns, questions. People asking if she was okay, if she was struggling emotionally, if she was under a lot of stress, if she was making decisions she might regret. The language sounded familiar, because it was. Richard wasn't creating a new story. He was activating one he'd been building for years, one concerned conversation at a time, one carefully placed comment at a time, one sympathetic sigh at a time. By the time the divorce became public, parts of the community already believed they knew what had happened, and according to that version of events, Caroline was the problem. What none of them realized was that Richard had been preparing this narrative long before she ever filed, long before she ever considered leaving, long before she even knew she needed to. And that discovery was about to become one of the most important revelations in the entire case. The rumors didn't arrive all at once. They arrived the way fog arrives. Slowly, quietly, almost invisibly. At first, Caroline wasn't even aware they existed. Then one afternoon, she received a call from an old friend, a woman she hadn't spoken to in months. The conversation began awkwardly, circled around small talk, then finally landed on the real reason for the call. "Can I ask you something?" Caroline already knew she wasn't going to like the question. The woman hesitated, then said, "People are saying you've been struggling for a while." A chill moved through her. "What people?" Another pause. Then came a name, then another, then another. By the end of the conversation, Caroline realized something that made her stomach drop. People weren't reacting to the divorce. They were reacting to a version of her that had existed long before the divorce. A version she had never known was being created. And suddenly dozens of confusing moments from the previous several years began making sense. Conversations that felt strange, people who seemed distant, friends who stopped reaching out. The story had already been written, and she had never been given a copy. What made the situation so painful wasn't that strangers believed it. It was that people she loved believed it. People who had sat at her dinner table. People who had watched her children grow up. People who had celebrated birthdays and holidays with her. Many of them genuinely thought Richard was the victim, not because they were malicious, because they were working with incomplete information. Richard had spent years carefully planting seeds. A concerned comment here. A worried observation there. A private conversation framed as concern rather than criticism. The strategy was brilliant in its simplicity. He never attacked her directly. He never said, "Caroline is unstable." Instead, he said things like, "I'm worried about her. She's been under a lot of pressure. Sometimes I don't know how to help her." People heard compassion. What they didn't hear was the narrative being built underneath it. And now that narrative was growing roots. Meanwhile, Gregory Walsh began preparing for war. The attorney's strategy was straightforward. If the evidence couldn't be defeated, destroy the credibility of the person presenting it. Every filing, every motion, every argument led back to the same claim. Caroline was emotional, unreliable, vindictive, a woman rewriting history to punish a good man. Richard supported the strategy completely. He believed it would work. After all, it always had. For years, he'd been able to challenge Caroline's version of events and watch her question herself. Why would this be any different? What he didn't understand was that Caroline wasn't alone anymore, and she wasn't relying on memory. She was relying on evidence. 3 weeks later, David Harrington finished reviewing the journals. All 41 of them. Thousands of pages. Years of entries. Years of dates. Years of conversations. years of patterns. When he called Caroline into his office, she expected legal advice. Instead, she received something else: validation. David placed several notebooks on the desk, looked at her, and said, "These may be the most important documents I've seen in 20 years of practice." For a moment, Caroline couldn't speak, not because she was surprised. Because she was overwhelmed. Those notebooks had never been intended for court. They weren't written for judges, or juries, or attorneys. They were written for survival, written because she was afraid of forgetting reality. And now they had become something else entirely: proof. The legal team began organizing the material. Patterns emerged quickly. Incidents separated by years mirrored one another almost perfectly. Arguments followed the same structure. Denials followed the same structure. Manipulations followed the same structure. The consistency was astonishing. No single entry proved everything. That wasn't the point. The point was the pattern. One incident can be misunderstood. Two incidents can be coincidence. 7 years of documented behavior becomes something much harder to explain away, and for the first time since the divorce began, David Harrington became confident. Not hopeful, confident. Because Richard's greatest strength had always been ambiguity. The journals removed ambiguity. Then the court appointed a forensic psychologist. And everything changed. The evaluation process took weeks. Interviews, records, collateral contacts, observations, documentation reviews. By the time the final report was completed, it exceeded 50 pages. The conclusions were devastating. The report described a sustained pattern of coercive control, psychological manipulation, reality distortion, isolation, financial dependency, behavior consistent with emotional abuse. More importantly, the psychologist found evidence suggesting these patterns extended beyond Caroline. There were indications that previous relationships followed similar trajectories. Different women, different circumstances, the same dynamics. For years, Richard had operated in private. Now his behavior was being analyzed professionally, objectively, systematically, and the conclusions were not in his favor. When Richard received the report, he was furious, not publicly, privately. The mask slipped, only briefly, but long enough. He accused attorneys of bias, psychologists of incompetence, the court system of unfairness, anyone except himself. Because accepting responsibility would require acknowledging something he had spent years avoiding. The possibility that the problem wasn't everyone else. The possibility that the problem was him. And that possibility was intolerable. Still, Richard remained confident, because he believed one thing above all else. He believed that if the case ever reached trial, people would see him, they would hear him speak, watch him testify, experience the charm that had protected him his entire life, and once they did, everything else would disappear. The journals, the reports, the accusations, all of it. He believed his greatest weapon remained intact, his ability to persuade, his ability to perform, his ability to make people trust him. For most of his life, that ability had never failed him. The trial would reveal whether it still worked. But before the courtroom doors opened, a discovery would emerge that neither Richard nor his attorney saw coming. A discovery buried inside years of emails, messages, and communications. A discovery that would expose something far more disturbing than manipulation, premeditation. Because while Caroline had been documenting the abuse, Richard had been documenting something too: the destruction of her credibility, and the evidence was about to surface. The thing about lies is that they leave fingerprints. Not always immediately, not always where you expect, but eventually, if you look closely enough, if you keep pulling at the loose threads, if you refuse to stop simply because the truth is inconvenient, the pattern begins to reveal itself. And that was exactly what was happening inside a conference room on the 3rd floor of a law office in downtown Nashville. At the time, nobody knew it yet. Not Richard, not Gregory Walsh, not even Caroline. But the case was about to change. Completely. Discovery is not glamorous. Television has convinced people that legal battles are won during dramatic courtroom speeches. In reality, cases are often won in silence, inside offices, inside folders, inside thousands of pages nobody outside the legal profession will ever read. For weeks, attorneys on both sides exchanged documents, Bank records, communications, employment files, financial disclosures, emails, text messages, years of information. Most of it was ordinary, painfully ordinary, the administrative debris of adult life. Then one afternoon, a junior associate working with David Harrington noticed something unusual. A text message. Just one. Nothing explosive. Nothing obvious. In fact, if you read it by itself, you might not have thought twice about it. Richard was messaging a colleague from work. The conversation appeared casual, the sort of exchange that happens every day between coworkers. But one sentence stood out. "Caroline's having another one of her episodes." The associate frowned. Episodes. An interesting word, a deliberate word, and more importantly, a familiar word, because she'd seen it before. Not in the journals, in other messages, other emails, other conversations. The same language appeared repeatedly. Episodes. Emotional, unstable, difficult, overwhelmed, concerned, always concerned, never cruel, never openly critical, always framed as sympathy. The associate started digging. The deeper she looked, the stranger things became. The messages stretched back years, not months, years. 3 years before the divorce filing, 4 years before, 5. Again and again, Richard was quietly describing Caroline to others. Not directly attacking her. That would have been too obvious. Instead, he painted a picture, one brushstroke at a time. A worried husband, a struggling wife, a man doing everything he could, a woman slowly falling apart. It was subtle, so subtle that nobody receiving those messages would have considered them malicious. That was what made them effective and dangerous. Because manipulation rarely works when it announces itself. It works when it disguises itself as concern. By the time David Harrington reviewed the communications, he felt something he rarely felt: shock. Not because manipulation was unusual. He had spent nearly 20 years practicing family law. Manipulation was practically part of the job description. No, what shocked him was the timeline. The divorce had not created the narrative. The narrative existed long before the divorce. Richard wasn't responding to accusations. He was preparing for them. Years before Caroline ever filed. Years before she spoke publicly. Years before she even understood what was happening to her. Richard had already begun building the case against her credibility. David sat in silence for a long moment, then picked up the phone. "Caroline," he said when she answered, "how soon can you come in?" She arrived the next morning. The conference room felt colder than usual, or maybe she was simply nervous. David rarely called without explanation. That alone was enough to make her anxious. He waited until she sat down, then slid a stack of printed messages across the table. Caroline looked at them, confused. At first, she didn't understand what she was seeing. Then she started reading. A few minutes passed, then 10, then 20. The room remained silent. The further she read, the paler she became. Because she wasn't discovering something new, she was discovering something old, something that had been happening around her for years, without her knowledge, without her consent, without her awareness. The realization felt almost physical, like being punched. Not because strangers believed it, because people she loved believed it. People she trusted. People she thought knew her. All receiving information from a source she never knew existed. Halfway through the stack, Caroline stopped reading. She looked up slowly, her eyes filled with tears. Not dramatic tears, not sobbing. The quieter kind. The kind that come when a terrible suspicion finally becomes certainty. "They already thought I was the problem." David nodded. "Some of them probably did." She stared at the papers. "I never had a chance." David was quiet for a moment. Then he said something she would remember long after the trial ended. "No." He tapped the stack. "You didn't know there was a game being played." That night, Caroline couldn't sleep. Not because of the trial, not because of the divorce, because of memory. The human mind does strange things when confronted with hidden truths. It starts revisiting old moments, old conversations, old expressions, old silences. Suddenly, things that once seemed confusing become obvious. A friend growing distant, an awkward conversation, a strange look, a canceled invitation, a conversation ending too quickly. One by one, the puzzle pieces began falling into place, and with every piece, a new realization emerged. Richard wasn't just controlling her reality, he was controlling the reality other people received about her. The next morning, she met with Dr. Okafor. She brought copies of the messages. For nearly an hour, they discussed them. Then Dr. Okafor said something that stopped Caroline cold. "This is one of the reasons victims struggle to leave." Caroline looked up. "What do you mean?" The therapist folded her hands. "Because by the time they realize what's happening, the abuser has often spent years preparing the audience." The audience. The word lingered, because that was exactly what it felt like. An audience. A group of people watching a play. Only Richard had been writing the script, and Caroline hadn't even known she was a character in it. Meanwhile, across town, Richard remained confident. The discovery hadn't reached him yet. He still believed the trial would come down to one thing: charm, credibility, presence. The same tools that had carried him through every difficult situation in his life. The same tools that had convinced people for years. He trusted them completely. Perhaps too completely. Because what he didn't understand was that evidence changes the rules. Charm works best in uncertainty. Evidence eliminates uncertainty. And David Harrington was about to introduce evidence Richard never expected anyone would find. The trial was only weeks away. The courtroom battle everyone feared was finally approaching. But before the first witness would testify, before the first opening statement, before Richard would take the stand and attempt to reclaim control of the narrative, something else needed to happen. 41 journals needed to be organized, and once they were, the truth would finally have a voice written over 7 years, one page at a time, one conversation at a time, one painful entry at a time. And that voice was about to enter the courtroom. The courthouse sat on a small rise overlooking the town, a red brick building with white columns, the kind of courthouse people passed every day without thinking about what happened inside. Marriage licenses, property disputes, traffic violations, custody hearings, leaves quietly changing behind heavy wooden doors. On the first morning of trial, Caroline parked 3 blocks away, not because parking was difficult, because she needed the walk. She needed a few extra minutes before stepping into the building where 7 years of her life would be examined, challenged, questioned, and judged. The air was cold, a gray Tennessee morning, the kind that makes everything feel still. She stood beside her car for a moment, staring at the courthouse. Then she took a deep breath and started walking. Inside, the building was already alive. Attorneys moved through hallways carrying boxes and briefcases. Court staff prepared exhibits. Reporters gathered near the entrance. Word of the case had spread farther than anyone expected. Not because it involved celebrities, not because it involved violence, because it involved something people found difficult to understand. Psychological abuse, coercive control, the invisible architecture of manipulation, the kind of harm that leaves no bruises, the kind of harm many people still struggle to recognize. And now a courtroom was being asked to decide whether something invisible could still be real. When Caroline entered the courtroom, she immediately saw them. Richard's supporters, friends, neighbors, former co-workers, people she had known for years, people she once considered part of her life. Many avoided eye contact. Some didn't. Some looked at her with sympathy, others with skepticism, a few with disappointment. Those hurt the most. Because disappointment implies belief. Belief that you have done something wrong. Belief that you have become someone else. Belief in a version of you that isn't true. Caroline felt her stomach tighten. For a brief moment, old fears returned. What if nobody believes me? What if Richard wins? What if all of this was for nothing? The thoughts came quickly. Then another voice answered them, a quieter voice, a stronger one, the voice she had spent years rebuilding. You know what happened. The fear didn't disappear, but it no longer controlled her. Across the room sat Richard, perfectly dressed, perfectly composed, perfectly calm. If someone had walked into the courtroom without context, they probably would have liked him immediately. That was part of the problem. Richard looked trustworthy. He always had. He was speaking softly with Gregory Walsh when Caroline entered. Then he noticed her. For a moment, their eyes met. Neither smiled. Neither waved. Neither looked away. Years of marriage, years of conflict, years of silence, compressed into a single glance. Then Richard turned back to his attorney. As though she were a stranger, the trial began with opening statements. Gregory Walsh spoke first. He was exactly what people expected: polished, confident, persuasive. For nearly an hour he laid out Richard's version of events: a devoted husband, a caring father, a patient man who had spent years trying to support an emotionally troubled spouse, a woman who had rewritten history, a woman motivated by resentment, a woman using the legal system as a weapon. The presentation was effective, dangerously effective. Several jurors listened attentively, taking notes, watching carefully. Caroline felt anxiety creeping back, because she had heard versions of this story before. Not in court, at home, across dinner tables, inside private conversations. It was the same story Richard had always told, only now he had a larger audience. Then David Harrington stood. Unlike Gregory Walsh, David didn't move dramatically. He didn't pace. He didn't perform. He simply walked to the center of the courtroom, placed both hands on the podium, and looked at the jury. Then he said something nobody expected. "This case is not about whether Richard is charming." The courtroom became still. David paused. "This case is not about whether he is respected." Another pause. "This case is not even about whether people like him." The jurors leaned forward, because they sensed something important. David continued. "This case is about what happens when nobody else is in the room." The silence deepened. Then he pointed toward the evidence table. 41 journals sat stacked inside organized boxes. Years of documentation, years of reality, years of survival. "The truth in this courtroom," David said quietly, "was written down long before anyone knew there would be a trial." And suddenly the room felt different, not convinced, not yet, but interested, very interested. The first witnesses appeared over the next several days: friends, family members, professionals, people who had observed pieces of the marriage. Amanda testified, calmly, honestly. She described the changes she'd witnessed in her sister, the shrinking confidence, the isolation, the growing uncertainty. At one point, Gregory Walsh stood for cross-examination. His questions were sharp, designed to undermine, designed to suggest bias. After all, Amanda was Caroline's sister. Wouldn't she naturally take Caroline's side? Amanda listened carefully, then answered with a sentence jurors would later discuss during deliberations. "I didn't take her side." She paused. "I watched her disappear." The courtroom fell silent, because everyone understood the difference. Dr. Renee Okafor testified next, and for the first time, the jury heard the language of coercive control explained clearly. Not emotionally, clinically, professionally, methodically. She described isolation, reality distortion, dependency, behavioral patterns, trauma responses, not as accusations, as observations. The testimony lasted nearly an entire day, and when it ended, several jurors looked visibly thoughtful. The case was beginning to take shape, not around individual incidents, around patterns. Patterns repeated hundreds of times over years, patterns difficult to dismiss once seen. Then came the journals, box after box, notebook after notebook, every entry dated, every incident documented, every conversation preserved. Jurors spent hours reviewing excerpts. Not every page. There were too many. But enough. More than enough. And a strange thing began happening. The same themes kept appearing. Again and again and again. Different years, different situations, same outcome. Confusion, denial, self-doubt, apology. The consistency became difficult to ignore, because lies often change over time. Truth tends to remain stubbornly the same. By the 6th day of trial, something had shifted. Not publicly, subtly, inside the jury box. People were paying attention differently now. The skepticism hadn't vanished, but curiosity had replaced certainty. And curiosity can be dangerous, especially for someone who depends on controlling the narrative. Richard sensed it too, though he would never admit it. The trial wasn't unfolding the way he'd expected. The journals were landing harder than anticipated. The psychologist was more persuasive than anticipated. The evidence was more organized than anticipated. For the first time since proceedings began, uncertainty entered the room. And uncertainty made Richard uncomfortable, because uncertainty meant one terrifying possibility. He might not be able to talk his way out of this. Then came the announcement everyone had been waiting for. Richard would testify. The decision carried risk. Enormous risk. But Richard insisted. He believed his greatest strength remained untouched. His ability to persuade. His ability to connect. His ability to make people believe him. For years, that ability had worked flawlessly. Why would a courtroom be any different? As the seventh day of trial ended, Richard prepared his testimony. Across town, Caroline sat alone in her living room, unable to sleep. She knew what was coming. She knew how convincing Richard could be. She knew how easily people trusted him. And despite everything, despite the journals, despite the evidence, despite the psychologist, despite the years of preparation, she was afraid. Because tomorrow, the man who had spent 7 years teaching her to doubt herself would sit in front of 12 strangers and ask them to do the same. And for the first few hours, it would seem like he was succeeding. But what Richard didn't know was that a single journal entry was waiting for him. A single page, written years earlier. A page so precise, so detailed, so impossible to explain away, that it would eventually become the moment everyone remembered. The moment the mask finally cracked, and the moment the courtroom saw what Caroline had been seeing all along. By the 8th day of trial, everyone was tired. The attorneys were tired. The jurors were tired. The court staff was tired. Even the reporters who had spent the past week taking notes from the gallery looked exhausted. But tired people often become observant people, because after days of testimony, something changes. The performance fades. The rehearsed answers become harder to maintain. The cracks begin to show. And on the morning Richard took the stand, nobody knew they were about to witness one. He arrived early, earlier than usual, wearing a navy suit and a silver tie. The same combination he'd worn to church on Easter Sunday 3 years earlier. Caroline remembered because she'd bought the tie herself. The memory hit her unexpectedly as she watched him walk into the courtroom. For a brief moment, she wasn't sitting beside David Harrington. She was back in the old house, back in the marriage, back in the years when she still believed things would get better. Then the moment passed, and reality returned. Richard sat at the defense table, straightened a stack of papers, adjusted his cufflinks, and waited. The picture of composure, the picture of confidence, the picture of a man who believed he belonged exactly where he was. When his name was called, Richard stood smoothly, walked to the witness stand, raised his right hand, and swore to tell the truth. For the next several hours, he was everything Caroline feared he would be: calm, measured, thoughtful, believable, very believable. Gregory Walsh guided him carefully through the testimony. Questions rehearsed, answers polished. The story unfolded exactly as Richard intended. He described himself as a devoted husband, a patient father, a man trying to support a wife struggling with emotional difficulties. He acknowledged mistakes, small mistakes, strategic mistakes. The kind people forgive easily, moments of frustration, moments of misunderstanding, normal marital conflict, nothing more, nothing less. At times, he even appeared vulnerable. His voice softened when discussing the children. His eyes grew moist, describing the collapse of the marriage. Several jurors listened intently. One took extensive notes. Another nodded subtly during portions of the testimony. From the gallery, Richard appeared strong, reasonable, credible, and Caroline felt something she hadn't felt in years. Fear, real fear, because this was how it had always worked. Richard didn't need to shout. He didn't need threats. He didn't need intimidation. He only needed people to believe him. By lunchtime, Gregory Walsh appeared satisfied. The direct examination had gone well, very well, perhaps too well, because confidence has a dangerous habit. It convinces people they're safe, and the moment people feel safe, they stop looking for danger. When court resumed after lunch, David Harrington stood. No dramatic gestures, no theatrics, no raised voice. He carried only a legal pad and a thin folder. That folder contained a single document, one page, one journal entry, one conversation, and enough truth to change everything. Cross-examination began quietly, almost disappointingly so. David asked simple questions, background questions, timeline questions, clarifications, nothing aggressive, nothing confrontational. Richard relaxed visibly. The answers came easily. The same confidence returned, the same control, the same certainty. For nearly 40 minutes, the exchange remained uneventful. Some observers began wondering whether David had missed his opportunity, whether the cross-examination would end without impact. Then David asked a question. Just one. Do you recall an evening in March, 4 years ago, involving a conversation in your kitchen? Richard frowned slightly. Not dramatically, just enough to indicate he was searching his memory. Then he nodded. Generally, yes. David glanced down at his notes. Did that conversation occur as described in your testimony this morning? Yes. No hesitation, no uncertainty. A clean answer, confident, immediate, the kind jurors tend to like. David nodded, then asked another question. And your testimony today is that you never made the statement your wife attributes to you during that conversation? That's correct. Again, no hesitation, no doubt. Richard looked comfortable, certain, safe. Then David opened the folder. The room seemed to become quieter, not because anyone knew what was coming, because instinctively people sensed something had changed. David removed a single page, nothing more. One page from one journal. Out of 41 notebooks, thousands of pages, years of entries. And somehow this single page felt heavier than all the others combined. David began reading, slowly, clearly, every word deliberate, the date, the location, the circumstances. Then the conversation itself, line by line, statement by statement. The details were extraordinary, not dramatic, specific, the kind of specificity that becomes difficult to fabricate. The weather, the time, the meal they'd eaten earlier, the exact wording of key exchanges, small details, human details, details that made the memory feel alive, real, immediate. As David continued reading, jurors began comparing the entry to the testimony they'd heard less than an hour earlier, and suddenly a problem emerged, a very large problem. The two versions could not both be true. David finished reading, closed the journal, looked up, then asked a single question. Mr. Walker, if this conversation never happened, can you explain why your wife's account from 4 years ago precisely contradicts testimony you gave under oath today? Silence. Not movie silence. Not dramatic silence. Real silence. The uncomfortable kind. The kind that stretches. The kind that forces everyone in the room to pay attention. For the first time in 8 days, Richard hesitated. Just briefly. A second. Maybe 2. But it was enough. Enough for jurors to notice. Enough for attorneys to notice. Enough for Caroline to notice. And most importantly, enough for Richard himself to notice. He recovered quickly, tried to explain, suggested memory errors, misinterpretations, context, confusion, the same explanations he'd used for years, the same explanations that had always worked before. But something was different now, because the audience was different. Caroline had spent years standing alone inside those conversations. Now 12 strangers were standing beside her, watching, comparing, evaluating, and for the first time, Richard's explanations sounded less convincing than the evidence itself. David didn't press. That was the brilliant part. He didn't argue, didn't attack, didn't raise his voice. He simply allowed the contradiction to exist, allowed jurors to sit with it, allowed them to draw their own conclusions. Then he said 4 words. "No further questions, Your Honor," and sat down. The courtroom remained quiet. Richard stayed on the stand for another few moments. But something had changed, subtly, irreversibly. The confidence that had carried him through the morning no longer looked quite the same. The certainty no longer felt absolute. The mask hadn't shattered. Not completely, but it had cracked. And once people see a crack, they start looking for others. That evening, conversations about the trial spread across town. People discussed testimony over dinner tables, in parking lots, on front porches, inside text messages. Most couldn't remember every legal argument. Most couldn't quote the psychologist's report. But nearly everyone remembered the same thing, the pause. that tiny hesitation, that brief moment when the man who always seemed to have an answer suddenly didn't. And sometimes, that's all it takes. Not proof, not certainty, just enough doubt to make people look closer. For Caroline, however, the moment felt different. She wasn't celebrating. She wasn't relieved. She wasn't even optimistic. She was exhausted, because she knew something most people didn't. The trial wasn't over. Not even close. The hardest part was still ahead. The jury still had to decide. The verdict still had to come. And verdicts have a way of ignoring expectations. For 2 more days, testimony continued. Then the lawyers would give their closing arguments. Then 12 strangers would disappear into a room. And everything Caroline had fought for would rest in their hands. But what nobody in that courtroom knew, not Richard, not Gregory Walsh, not even David Harrington, was that the deliberations would last longer than anyone expected. Much longer. And during those long hours behind closed doors, the 41 journals would become impossible to ignore. Because once the jury began seeing the pattern, they couldn't unsee it. The jury disappeared on a Thursday afternoon. 12 strangers, 12 lives, 12 people carrying the weight of 7 years they had not lived, but had spent the past 11 days trying to understand. The courtroom doors closed behind them. And suddenly, there was nothing left to do. No more testimony, no more evidence, no more arguments, only waiting. And waiting, Caroline would later say, has a way of revealing what fear still remains. The first few hours weren't so bad. There was still movement, still activity. Attorneys packed files. Court staff moved in and out of offices. People talked quietly in hallways. The machinery of the legal system continued turning. But by evening, the courthouse was nearly empty. The silence felt heavier, more personal. Caroline drove home, made dinner she didn't eat, turned on the television she didn't watch, and spent most of the night staring out the living room window, not thinking about the verdict, thinking about the years before it. Because that's what happens when you've been carrying something for a long time. The closer you get to setting it down, the more aware you become of how heavy it was. Around midnight, she found herself sitting at the kitchen table. The same kitchen table where she'd written so many journal entries. The same table where she'd once sat convinced she might be losing her mind. The same table where she'd slowly, painfully rebuilt trust in her own reality. She ran her fingers across the wood and realized something. Regardless of what happened tomorrow, she wasn't that woman anymore. The woman who started the journals had needed proof. The woman sitting at the table now no longer did. She already knew what was true. The trial hadn't given her that. The verdict wouldn't either. She had earned it herself. One difficult day at a time. Friday came. No verdict. The jury requested additional exhibits, additional testimony transcripts, additional portions of the journals. Hours passed. Then more hours. Still nothing. Speculation spread quickly. Some people viewed the delay as a bad sign. Others viewed it as a good one. The truth was simpler. The jurors were working, taking the evidence seriously, trying to understand something far more complicated than most legal disputes. Because unlike a broken contract or a property disagreement, coercive control doesn't exist inside a single moment. It exists inside patterns, and patterns take time to see. Across town, Richard appeared calm, at least publicly. Privately, the story was different. Gregory Walsh noticed it first. The impatience, the frustration, the constant questions. Richard wanted predictions, probabilities, reassurance, things no attorney can honestly provide during deliberations. Because once a jury enters that room, control disappears. And Richard had spent most of his life avoiding situations where he wasn't in control. Now he was trapped inside one. Friday evening arrived. Still no verdict. The jury went home. The waiting continued. That night, Caroline slept better than she had expected. Not because she wasn't worried, because she was tired, profoundly tired. The kind of exhaustion that reaches deeper than the body. The exhaustion of carrying fear for years. The exhaustion of constantly questioning yourself. The exhaustion of surviving. And for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to imagine a future. Not a legal outcome. A future. A house chosen by her. A life directed by her. Mornings that belonged to her. conversations that didn't leave her doubting herself. The vision felt fragile, but it felt possible, and that mattered. The jury disappeared for nearly 2 days. 44 hours. 44 hours of waiting. 44 hours of wondering whether 7 years of truth would finally be believed. Then, on a cold Saturday morning, the courtroom filled once again. The jury had reached a verdict. The foreperson stood, the room fell silent, and one by one, the findings were read into the record. The court found in Caroline's favor. The journals were believed. The evidence was believed. And for the first time in years, Caroline was believed. A tear rolled down her cheek. Not because she had won, because she no longer had to prove she was sane. Across the courtroom, Richard sat motionless. For years, his version of reality had controlled every room he entered, but not this one. Not anymore. When the hearing ended, Caroline stepped outside. The Tennessee air felt different somehow, lighter. Not because the pain had disappeared, because she finally understood something. The verdict wasn't what saved her. The day she stopped doubting herself had saved her. The verdict simply confirmed what she already knew. Months later, Richard appealed. The legal battle continued, but the core findings remained unchanged. And slowly, Caroline began building a life that no longer revolved around surviving one. Then something unexpected happened. She started telling her story, at first only to a few people, then to support groups, then to complete strangers, and everywhere she shared it, the same response appeared. People recognized themselves. Women, men, people who had spent years believing they were losing their minds. People who finally had a name for what was happening to them. The journals that once protected Caroline's reality were now helping others reclaim theirs. Then one ordinary Thursday afternoon, a letter arrived. No return address, no warning, just a plain white envelope. Inside was something Caroline had waited years to hear. An apology, written in Richard's own handwriting. She opened the letter, read every word, and halfway through, she found the sentence she never expected to see. I caused harm. For years, she imagined how that moment would feel. She thought it would heal her. She thought it would change everything. It didn't, because healing had already happened. The apology mattered, but not because it saved her. It mattered because it confirmed what she had known all along, the truth. And suddenly, Caroline understood something many survivors spend years learning. The person who breaks your trust is not the person responsible for restoring it. That responsibility belongs to you. The apology wasn't the ending, it was simply a footnote, because the real ending had already been written, not by Richard, not by the court, not by a therapist, by Caroline, in the life she built afterward, a life filled with peace, friendships restored, confidence reclaimed, a future she chose for herself. Years later, Caroline found the very first notebook, the one she bought on the night she feared she was losing her mind. She flipped through the pages slowly, reading the words of a woman who was frightened, confused, alone, but still brave enough to write, still brave enough to preserve the truth. She closed the journal, held it in her hands, and smiled, because she finally understood what those notebooks had really been. Not evidence, not records, not preparation for court. They were proof of something much more important. Proof that even when someone tried to rewrite her reality, a part of her never stopped believing herself. And perhaps that is the real lesson of Caroline's story. The truth does not become real when someone else finally admits it. The truth is real whether they admit it or not. 41 journals, 7 years of documented abuse, 22 months of preparation, 11 days of trial, 1 apology, and a life rebuilt. But after everything, the most important sentence in Caroline's story wasn't written in a courtroom. It wasn't written in a journal, and it wasn't written in a letter. It was written in the life she built afterward, a life that quietly said, I know what happened, I know what is true, and I no longer need anyone else's permission to believe it. Thank you for listening. And before you go, tell us in the comments, would you have seen it? Would you have recognized what was happening behind closed doors? Or would you have believed the story everyone else believed? If this story moved you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more stories from Whispered Chapter Tales. And wherever you are tonight, take care of yourself. Your voice matters. Your reality matters. And your story deserves to be heard.